Early October, I was 43 and newly off a long infrastructure project that had left my head full of deadlines and traffic counts. I booked a solo backcountry permit in northern Minnesota because it was one of the few places where effort stays honest. Paddle, carry, camp, repeat. I chose a small island site for wind protection and privacy, a clean circle of rock and jack pine that matched what my laminated topo map called campsite number 12. My days were structured on purpose: paddle in the morning, map study at midday, journal at dusk, like I was reteaching my body how to be quiet again. If you want more realistic, first-person accounts like this, subscribe for the next one. At night, the lake did what it always does in cold weather, pushing water against granite in a steady rhythm that made sleep feel earned instead of forced. I went there for deliberate isolation. No cell service, no messages, no competing voices. 4 nights felt like a practical length, long enough to settle, short enough to stay disciplined. I packed food the way I pack for work travel, itemized and sealed, everything in a bright yellow waterproof barrel that I strapped 40 yards inland, away from the shoreline, away from curiosity with teeth. The forecast was clear but cold, lows around 34. The only real annoyance was docking. The island's west landing was narrow and awkward, and the wind kept shifting just enough to bump the canoe offline as I stepped out. It was minor, the kind of inconvenience that keeps you attentive without feeling threatened. The second morning, I noticed my canoe was angled differently than I remembered. Its bow pointed a little more toward open water instead of the notch in the rock where I'd nudged it. The lake can rotate things in small ways, and granite doesn't forgive assumptions, so I blamed wind and current and moved on. Later, inside the tent vestibule, one boot was tipped on its side, toe out toward the lake. The ground there was uneven, gear settles. Before sunrise the air was completely still, no wind, no insects, so quiet that the smallest adjustments felt louder than they should. I corrected the boot, told myself I was just over-noticing, and made coffee. It didn't stop. Each day there were small repositionings that didn't cost me anything but kept asking for my attention. The paddle shifted a few inches from where I leaned it. My folded map looked refolded. The cooking pot handle faced a different direction. Nothing was missing. Nothing was damaged. It was the subtlety that made it hard to argue with. By the third day I started taking photos before I left camp for short fishing loops around the island. I'd frame the tent, the barrel strap, the paddle angle against a certain crack in the rock. Proof for a mind that likes proof. If you enjoy slow burn, realistic horror, leave a like. When I came back, the photos didn't match. The differences were small, almost petty, but consistent enough to be measurable. A chair leg turned, a knot in the rope now on the other side of the barrel handle. I scanned the open channel, 300 yards to the nearest tree line, and saw no other canoes, no wakes, no smoke, nothing that explained another person sharing my square of wilderness. Late on the third evening, while I cooked, I reached for the food barrel and felt the lid move under my hand. It had loosened about half a turn. I stood there with my fingers on the ridged plastic, trying to replay the last time I sealed it. I was certain I'd tightened it. I even checked the photos from earlier, timestamp 2:17 p.m., and saw the latch aligned the way I always align it. I inspected the rim and the lid. No tooth impressions. No claw marks. The food inside was intact, the smell unchanged. When I snapped the latch shut, it made a small metallic click that sounded too crisp in the cooling air. That was when my mind stopped offering weather as an explanation and started offering intention. After dark, I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the lake and distant loons, waiting for the usual drift into sleep. The steady lap of water against granite was familiar, almost mechanical, and the cold made the air feel thin. Around 1:40 a.m., I heard footfalls on rock near the west landing, slow, measured, evenly spaced, heel to toe in a way that didn't match an animal's scatter or a bear's heavy shuffle. I didn't sit up. I kept my breathing shallow and even, the way I do when I'm trying not to feed a thought. People get lost. People misjudge distances at night. Someone could have mistaken my island for theirs. The steps paused beside my overturned canoe. A soft scrape followed, not a kick, not a stumble, more like fingertips testing the hull's edge, feeling its texture. My first impulse was to reach for my headlamp, to force the situation into visibility, but I didn't. Light would announce exactly where I was. I watched my digital wristwatch glow 1:43 a.m. and waited for the next sound to explain itself. The footfalls moved inland, away from the shoreline, toward the tree line and the darker center of the island. They didn't angle toward my tent. They passed at a distance I could not confidently estimate, close enough to hear weight shift on dry rock, far enough that I couldn't hear clothing. Then there was nothing. No splash. No paddle dip. No boat nudging stone. I listened for a long time, trying to catch the proof of departure, and heard only water doing what it had been doing all night. At first light, the gray kind that flattens shadows, I walked the shoreline slowly. There was no second canoe pulled up, no fresh drag marks, no broken reed stems. Granite is unforgiving that way. It holds very little of you. My own canoe, though, was different. It had been rotated parallel to shore, careful and deliberate, as if someone had wanted it positioned for an easy push-off. I stood with my hands on the gunwale and tried to make wind responsible for that precision. It didn't fit. I broke camp methodically instead of staying the planned fourth night. My original departure had been scheduled for 11 a.m. I left at 6:12 a.m., choosing a route that would put me past a ranger-monitored exit point, the closest thing to a witness. At the ranger station, I asked the practical questions in a practical voice. No other solo permits were issued for that zone during my dates. There were no reports of habituated bears, no known trespass issues, no maintenance crews scheduled. The ranger's answers were calm, routine, the kind that usually settles a story into a category. Mine wouldn't settle. Later, at home, I reviewed my photos in better light, not looking for faces, just for continuity. In one image, file name DSC_1843, the far shoreline reflection held a thin vertical shape that wasn't present in the others. It could have been a snag, a trick of angle, a momentary alignment of trees. The problem was that it looked placed, like something chosen to be noticed only after the fact. I still canoe. I still like the clean arithmetic of distance and effort. But I avoid islands now, even when they're the best campsites on the map. Isolation used to feel geometric to me. Water as boundary, solitude as a controlled variable. That week changed the equation in a quiet way. Solitude doesn't guarantee singularity. What stays with me isn't panic. It's restraint. Whoever was there never rushed, never searched, never tested the tent, only adjusted what I thought I controlled, and left the water to keep its steady rhythm against granite. If you know someone who appreciates grounded horror like this, share it with them, and subscribe for the next account. Late March. I was 45 and coming off a winter trauma season that felt longer than it was. I'm an orthopedic surgeon, and by February the hospital alarms start to feel like a second pulse under your own. I rented a remote desert cabin in southern Utah, bordering open BLM land, because I wanted distance measured in miles, not minutes. The nearest paved road was 14 miles away. No visible neighbors. Elevation 5,800 feet. I built a simple routine. Sunrise hikes along the ridgeline, reading in the afternoon, bed early. The wind dragged lightly across the corrugated metal roof each evening, a dry, steady sound that felt clean. If you prefer realistic, first-person accounts like this, subscribe for the next one. I was there for physical quiet after months of monitors and overhead pages. The cabin was simple but sufficient. Solar panels, a propane stove, and a 250-gallon cylindrical rainwater tank behind the structure. The owner's only warning had been about temperature drops at night, how quickly warmth disappears once the sun goes. The first evening I noticed the water pressure fluctuated unpredictably, the faucet stuttering before evening out. I attributed it to air in the lines or sediment. After sunset, the metal roof ticked softly as it cooled, small contractions echoing in the otherwise open silence. It all felt consistent with desert mechanics, expansion, contraction, nothing personal in it. The first night I heard knocking just after turning off the interior lights. It was distant and hollow, irregular enough that I assumed siding adjusting to temperature change. Desert cabins flex. I've seen worse in older barns. The second night it happened again, same quality, same uneven spacing. I checked the time, 9:47 p.m. Both nights. What caught my attention wasn't the sound itself, but its timing. It began only after I turned off the lights. Between knocks, there was complete desert silence. No insects, no traffic, no hum of anything mechanical. The gaps felt deliberate, though I had no reason to think they were. Over the next 2 evenings, the knocking shifted location. Sometimes it came from the rear wall near the water tank. Sometimes from the side facing the open wash. During daylight, I inspected the exterior thoroughly, pressed on panels, checked screws, looked for loose flashing. Everything was secure. On the third night, I left the interior lights on intentionally and sat reading until nearly 10. No knocking, At 10:02 p.m., I switched off the lamps and remained still. Within 2 minutes, it began again. The pattern was consistent enough to test, but subtle enough to doubt. Darkness in the desert feels immediate. Twilight collapses quickly into full black. If you appreciate slow burn, grounded horror, leave a like. The porch bulb was rated at 800 lumens. I began to think in those terms: lumens, exposure, stimulus, like I was troubleshooting a device rather than listening to a wall. On the fourth night, I turned off the lights and stepped outside immediately, intending to catch the sound in progress. The knocking stopped the moment I opened the door. The air was completely still. No wind movement, no brush scraping against siding. The thermometer mounted beside the door read 31 degrees Fahrenheit. I stood there longer than necessary, letting my eyes adjust. The desert at night is vast but not chaotic. Sounds travel cleanly. I realized then that the knocking wasn't structural. It reacted. It required darkness and enclosure. The moment I altered either, it ceased. On my final planned night, I extinguished all interior lights deliberately and remained seated in the dark, back against the interior wall where I'd most often heard the sound. I kept my breathing even, hands resting loosely on my knees. After about a minute, the knocking began, closer this time, lower on the wall, almost at shoulder height if I imagined someone standing outside. The intervals were slower, more measured. I didn't move. I wanted to separate imagination from stimulus. Then the sound changed. It wasn't a knock anymore. It was pressure, a subtle flex inward, like weight leaning against the siding between studs. Not an impact, not a strike. Sustained contact. I felt it through the wall against my back, a slight give in the structure. Fine grit of sand shifted faintly along the hard ground outside, a whispering movement. I didn't switch on the lights. Instead, I retrieved my keys from the table by touch and moved quietly to the rear exit. I stepped out into the cold and circled the cabin wide, keeping distance from the front wall. The ground held only my vehicle's tire tracks from arrival. No fresh impressions. No silhouettes against the horizon. When I returned to the front, I ran my hand along the siding. Between two studs, the panel bowed inward slightly. In the dim starlight, I could make out an indentation roughly 18 inches wide. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise. I left the interior lights on for the remainder of the night and did not attempt sleep. At dawn, the morning sun flattened the cabin's shadow, reducing the siding to ordinary lines again. The indentation was less obvious in daylight, almost dismissible if you weren't looking for it. I photographed it anyway. Departure had been planned for the following afternoon, but I packed at first light and left at 7:18 a.m. I didn't contact the owner. Rational explanations existed: thermal shifts, structural stress, perhaps an animal pressing without clawing. None felt complete. All felt possible. That uncertainty was its own category. Weeks later, back at the hospital, I reviewed the images on my phone during a break. Under fluorescent lighting, with the hum of a refrigerator in the staff room behind me, I zoomed in on one photo, IMG_7724. There were faint vertical scuff marks at the indentation site. The spacing was roughly shoulder width. No claw punctures. No tearing. Just surface abrasion, as if something steady had leaned and adjusted. I checked local wildlife reports from that week. No unusual sightings in that zone. No complaints from other renters. The desert had resumed its neutrality. I still rent remote cabins when I need distance, but I no longer turn the lights off completely. Darkness in open country isn't absence, it's invitation. The knocking stopped only when I acknowledged it, when I refused to leave the structure unlit and unattended. Sometimes, even now, I glance at the clock at 9:47 p.m. without meaning to. I picture that slight inward bow in the siding, an 18-inch quiet suggestion that something once leaned there and waited. If this account stayed with you, share it with someone who appreciates grounded horror, and subscribe for the next one. Early September, I was 42 and overdue for something that wasn't a conference call or a shipment delay. I'm a logistics manager, and most of my problems are solved with tracking numbers and contingency plans. I used accumulated airline miles for a solo fly-in fishing trip in Alaska, the kind where a float plane drops you at a small inland lake and promises to return in 5 days. The cabin was government issued, backcountry standard, no locks, just a door that shut cleanly. The lake was approximately 1.3 miles long, narrow enough to see tree line on both sides. Wind moved constantly across the surface, a low ripple that never fully stopped. If you appreciate realistic, first-person accounts like this, subscribe for the next one. I wanted controlled isolation, not survival theatrics. Enough distance to think, but within a system, permits, pickup times, a ranger logbook on the table. The float plane was scheduled to retrieve me at 2 p.m. on Friday. Inside the cabin, the air smelled faintly of damp wood and iron. The logbook lay open to a blank page, though the last dated entry was 3 weeks earlier. I assumed the previous visitor had left it that way. I signed my name, noted the date, and closed it without much thought. The structure was basic: cot, small iron stove, wooden table. It felt neutral, like a tool waiting to be used. That first evening, before turning in, I closed the logbook and placed it on the shelf above the small iron stove. The next morning, it was back on the table, opened again to a blank page. I stood there longer than necessary, trying to recall if I'd moved it absent-mindedly. Travel fatigue does that, erases small sequences. I repositioned it deliberately, this time pressing it flat against the wall on the shelf. The silence inside the cabin was so complete it felt pressurized, as if sound itself had weight. I told myself it was nothing more than adjustment to a new environment. Over the next 2 days, minor things shifted. The spoon I left angled toward the stove handle pointed slightly outward when I returned from fishing. The chair I pushed under the table sat an inch back from its original position. Nothing was missing. Nothing disturbed in any meaningful way. I began making faint pencil dots to confirm placement, one beneath the table leg, another near the stove corner. When I came back from the lake, the dots no longer aligned with the object edges. The shoreline remained empty. No boat engines, no distant paddles crossing the 1.3-mile length of water. Each morning I scanned the tree line, clear for at least 400 yards in all directions. If you prefer slow burn, grounded tension, leave a like. Inside, my own footsteps sounded amplified against the wooden floorboards, as though the cabin were listening back. On the third night, after returning from a short hike along the bank, I shut the door firmly. The hinge had a distinct squeak at the final inch of closure. Later, as I prepared to sleep, I noticed the door slightly ajar, no more than an inch, but enough to catch moonlight along the floor. I would have heard that hinge reopen. I sat still on the cot for several minutes, listening to the wind press gently against the doorframe. The door opened inward, not outward. Any pressure from wind would have pushed it tighter shut, not eased it open. The realization settled slowly. Whatever movement was happening occurred while I was outside. On the fourth morning, I altered my routine. I packed my rod and tackle as usual, shouldered my bag, and walked loudly down the shoreline, so that anyone listening would assume I'd left for hours. After rounding a bend in the lake, I cut quietly back through brush, moving slowly to avoid snapping twigs. From partial concealment about 60 yards away, I positioned myself behind a stand of alder and waited with the cabin in clear view. The wind rippled steadily across the lake surface, flattening reflections. My watch read 8:26 a.m. when the cabin door shifted. It opened slowly, not wide, just enough to change the geometry of shadow inside the doorway. At first I saw nothing, then a slight alteration in light, an absence within the frame. Someone stood just inside the threshold, far enough back that I couldn't see features, only the way the interior darkness adjusted around a body. The figure didn't step out. It didn't scan the shoreline. It remained within the doorway's rectangle, as if testing visibility without committing to exposure. I could hear my own pulse more clearly than the wind. After roughly a minute, the door closed again with measured control. No sudden movement. No attempt to flee. The handle returned to its resting position. I stayed where I was another 10 minutes, waiting for a second action. Nothing followed. I didn't approach immediately. I remained concealed for nearly 2 hours, watching for repetition. When I finally walked openly toward the cabin, I made enough noise to signal my return. The interior looked unchanged except for one detail. The chair was angled toward the window, as if positioned for observation rather than sitting. I packed my gear calmly, minimizing time inside. Instead of sleeping on the cot that night, I moved my sleeping bag outside beside the overturned canoe, fully visible from all directions. The midday sun reflected harshly off the lake, eliminating deep shadows. I maintained routine motions, but my awareness never left the door. The float plane arrived exactly at 2 p.m. on Friday. The pilot mentioned no other scheduled drops in that region that week. Later, at the ranger station, I asked about maintenance patrols. None had occurred during my stay. Weeks afterward, reviewing phone photos, I zoomed in on one image of the cabin threshold. In the dirt just inside the doorway was faint compression that didn't match my boot tread. I wear size 11, distinctive cross-hatched soles. This impression was smoother, more linear. The engine drone of the departing float plane that day had felt like release. In hindsight, it sounded more like retreat. I still fish remote waters. I still value distance measured in miles. But I no longer trust enclosed isolation. The figure in that doorway never advanced, never confronted, never spoke. It only occupied space I assumed was mine and demonstrated that presence doesn't require approach. When I think about it now, I see that doorway framed against pale morning light, the cabin number 4B stenciled faintly above it, and a subtle shift in shadow that had weight but no face. If this account stays with you, share it with someone who appreciates grounded horror, and subscribe for the next one.